Welcome, dear viewers, to our channel, where we present you with mysterious and true stories that delve into the depths of the most chilling and thought-provoking events. Today we take you deep into a history filled with mystery and controversy as we tell the story of Alfred Packer, the man accused of the most horrifying acts in the snowy mountains of Colorado. Between survival, lies, and cannibalism, Packer remains an enigma to all who have tried to unravel his tale. If you're eager to uncover what really happened during that harsh winter and how this story became a part of history and local folklore, don't miss this episode. We invite you to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you're the first to catch our latest episodes. Don't forget to support us with a like and share this episode with fans of terrifying and mysterious stories. Now let's dive into a journey of horror and intrigue with Alfred Packer. In the Colorado Rockies, where the snow is deep and cold, and a man afoot can starve to death unless he's brave and bold. Oh, Alfred Packer, you'll surely go to hell while all the others starve to death. You dined a bit too well, from the Ballad of Alfred Packer. The strange odyssey of Alfred G. Packer has generated much controversy over the years, from those who believe he murdered and cannibalized 5 men for his own profit to those who insist he was innocent of murder and merely ate human flesh to survive. He's considered something of a local hero in some parts of Colorado, and despite evidence that supports his more nefarious side, people continue to defend him. From books to newspaper accounts during the time of tabloid journalism, to official documents in the Colorado State Archives, there are nearly as many versions of the story as Packer himself told. All rely on him as the sole witness, with the exception of those who saw the results of what he had done. In 1873, Alfred Packer, 31, went with a group of 20 other prospectors from Bingham Canyon, Utah, near Salt Lake City, into the San Juan Mountains in Colorado to seek wealth from mining minerals, including gold. He claimed to have been the guide for this expedition, but there is evidence that this may have been an exaggeration, if not an outright fabrication. Apparently, some of the food supply was lost along the way, and the would-be miners grew hungry and desperate. The party arrived in January 1874 into Chief Uray's Ute camp in northwestern Colorado, near Montrose, where they were cared for and urged to remain until spring. At that time of year, the mountain passes were treacherous, the Ute said, and snow could bury men. It would not be wise to proceed. Nevertheless, a handful of these prospectors could not wait. They wanted to get to the mines before anyone else. 5 of them, frenzied by the prospecting spirit, decided to risk all and continue over the mountains to the Los Pinos Indian Agency on Cochetopa Creek near Saguache and Gunnison. Packer joined them. They left on February 9th. Many years later, Packer claimed that another group of 5 had gone out before them. With a 10-day supply of food for a 75-mile trip, they apparently thought it was 40, the doomed men who left Chief Uray's camp with Packer were Shannon Wilson Bell, Israel Swan, James Humphrey, Frank Reddy Miller, and George California Noon, who was only 18. Aside from Packer, that was the last time anyone saw these men alive. More than 2 months passed, and people wondered where they were. The next event is confusing. Either a party of prospectors came through in the spring and asked about them, sending out search parties, or Packer himself emerged. The popular story has it that Packer came out alone from the winter wilderness and walked into the Los Pinos Indian Agency. It was April 16th, the Colorado State Archives say April 6th. Some witnesses say they saw him in the nearby town of Saguache more than a week earlier. Oddly, when he arrived, he had several wallets in his possession from which he extracted rolls of money, and although he professed having gone for more than a day without food, he asked for nothing to eat. He just wanted some whiskey. He mentioned that he'd hurt his leg and had fallen behind, so he was not sure where the others from his party were. He had expected them to beat him out of the mountains, but the prospectors had not been seen. People who listened to his tales at the saloon thought that he'd taken the dead men's possessions. Then, an Indian guide walking along the trail found strips of meat, which turned out to be human flesh. Packer's tales began to sound like outright lies. From all appearances, he had killed the others, survived off their meat, and enriched himself with their assets. About a month after he emerged from the wilderness alone, Packer admitted that he knew what had happened to the others in his party, and he was willing to provide details. On May 8th, his confession was given and signed under General Charles Adams' supervision at the Los Pinos Indian Agency. Right away, poor weather conditions hindered the party's progress, Packer said, and their supplies eventually ran out. Streams and lakes were too frozen or treacherous to fish, and wild game was scarce. They could not turn back, but they were not optimistic about going forward either. Since they were already starving, their situation looked bleak. Packer's statement to General Adams indicated that the other 5 men had died at various stages of their journey, either as starvation overtook them or as they were killed in self-defense from one another's hunger-maddened attacks. Ultimately, the bodies were found at various places along the trail. Israel Swan, being the oldest at around 65, died first, about 10 days after the group departed, and the survivors had all taken pieces from him to eat. Then, 4 or 5 days later, James Humphrey died and was also eaten. He proved to have $133 in his pocket, and Packer admitted that he had taken it. The man was no longer going to need it, so why not? Why the other 2 did not search the body or question Packer's theft is not clear. The third man to die, Packer referred to him as the butcher, was Frank Miller, in an accident that occurred while Packer was searching for wood. He did not specify what kind of accident. The other 2 who were still alive decided to eat him, since he was dead, and Packer returned to find this activity already in progress. The next to go was the boy, George Noon. Packer reported that while he was off for several days hunting for game, Bell had shot California Noon with Swan's gun. Packer had returned, and together they ate him. That left only Packer and Bell. Despite the fact that they had just dined, it seems that Bell decided that he was going to be the only survivor. Bell wanted to kill me, Packer's report indicates. Struck at me with his rifle, struck a tree, and broke his gun. So Packer had killed him first, and that left only one. Why Packer had not offered this tale immediately upon returning to the settlement is not made clear in his confession, and perhaps was not even questioned. He swore that this statement was the truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. Knowing that the 5 prospectors lay out in the open somewhere, a search party went out, led by a reluctant Packer. He took them where he believed he had last seen the others, but they failed to find the missing prospectors. It seems clear in retrospect, in view of what came next, that Packer was scheming for a way to clear himself or get away. But before he could do anything, he was arrested and jailed in Saguache on suspicion of murder. Apparently, the authorities did not believe his account. Their suspicions were soon confirmed. As it turned out, the lost prospectors had not been killed one by one and left along the way. Packer's confession was a lie. In August 1874, John A. Randolph, an artist sent out to Colorado for Harper's Weekly magazine, came across a startling sight at Slumgullion Pass. 5 sets of human remains lay in a cluster near the bank of the Lake Fork of the Gunnison River, just 2 miles from present-day Lake City. He realized at once that this had to be the prospectors. One account states that a road-building crew found the remains first, but there are no records about the find at that time, so it's likely untrue that anyone had discovered them before Randolph. Among the remains were pieces of torn clothing, blankets, and some shreds of flesh, but weather and animals had clearly done damage to the evidence. Their feet were still bound in the blankets that they had torn for that purpose, and Randolph found no shoes, cooking utensils, or guns around them. It appeared that they had not only been murdered where they lay, but also horribly ravaged, and one set of remains was missing its head. 2 had pieces of flesh cut out, one out of the breast and one out of the thigh, and one appeared to have put up a fight. Randolph spent some time at the site, sketching them all in a detailed composition that would be immortalized, and then reported his discovery. The Hinsdale County coroner, W.F. Ryan, hurried to the spot with 20 other men to hold an inquest, but unfortunately for history, he put nothing into writing. A member of the original party that had left Utah, Preston Nutter, identified the remains as those of his former companions, and by a process of elimination, it was determined that Frank Miller was the one without a head. The coroner made sure that the witnesses all got a good look for the approaching trial, and then had the bodies buried together in graves on a high bluff nearby, overlooking the spot of their discovery. Individual slabs were set up to memorialize each of the deceased. Randolph also sketched the burial place, and the area became known as Dead Man's Gulch. After they finished this grisly deed and returned to town to confront Packer with his obvious lies, they learned that he had escaped from the Civ-like jail at Saguache. Some said he'd had the assistance of an accomplice. Where he might have gone, no one knew. There's long been confusion over the correct spelling of Packer's name. Official documents from the military, court proceedings, and even his tombstone list it as Alfred G. Packer. Yet during his first stint in the military, he had written it as Alfred, and had that spelling tattooed on his arm. Or the tattoo artist made the error, which amused him, and he subsequently adopted it, depending on which account is to be believed. He was known to spell it this way on other occasions as well. The invitations to his hanging followed suit. Packer was born on November 21st, 1842, some say January 21st, in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. As he grew up, he learned the cobbler trade. Then the Civil War broke out involving Pennsylvania, and he was of the right age to enlist. When he was 19, he went west and enlisted in the 16th U.S. Infantry in Winona, Minin. But by the end of the year, epilepsy had forced him out with an honorable discharge. By June 1863, he was back, enlisting in the 8th Regiment in the Iowa Cavalry. Once again, he didn't last. He was mustered out due to epilepsy. One report says that he served with General Custer as a scout. 10 years later, he was among those who left Utah on a mining expedition. He said that he'd driven ore wagons in some mining camps, which gave him the expertise to guide, but it turned out to everyone's misfortune that he actually knew very little about the area to which they were going. The fact that he had taken the opportunity to escape from jail, rather than face a tribunal of his peers, suggested to many that he was a liar, thief, and murderer. Yet it was a big country, and he knew his way around the wilderness, so it seemed probable he might disappear rather than be brought to justice. Months went by, and then years. Packer managed to elude the law for 9 years by living under the assumed name of John Schwartz. No one knows how he made a living for all that time, or why he ventured back so close to where people knew him. But finally, in March 1883, Frenchy Cabazon, a former member of the original party, recognized his laugh in a saloon in Fort Fetterman, Wyoming. Packer was captured only 300 miles from where he'd begun to run. Unmasked and rearrested, he went before a grand jury, which returned 5 indictments against him for the hatchet murders of the 5 hapless prospectors. Packer offered yet a second confession on March 16, 1883, again under the supervision of the same General Adams. He said that he and the others had left Chief Ouré's camp with 7 days' worth of food provisions for one man. In other words, not much. After 2 or 3 days, they encountered a snowstorm. As they moved from mountain to gulch, they found the deep snow impenetrable in places. By the 4th day, they had only a pint of flour left out of all their provisions. They just kept going. 10 days into their treacherous trek, as they were surviving on rosebuds and pine gum, some of them showed signs of serious depression, even madness. They came upon a lake and cut holes in the ice to fish, but had no luck. They continued on. Swan was growing angry and told Packer to go up the mountain with the rifle and scout out the terrain. Packer claimed that he was a guide for the others. He said that when he went scouting, all he could find was more snow. The situation looked hopeless, especially since Bell had been acting crazy that morning, as if hunger were twisting his mind. When Packer returned with nothing positive to report, he said that he found Bell sitting by a fire, roasting a large piece of meat, which he had cut out of the leg of the German butcher, i.e., Miller. The latter's body was lying the furthest off from the fire down the stream. His skull was crushed in with a hatchet. The other 3 men were lying near the fire. They were cut in the forehead with the hatchet. Some had 2, some 3 cuts. As Packer approached the fire, Bell picked up the bloody hatchet to attack him too. In self-defense, Packer claimed he shot the man through the stomach, sideways. When Bell dropped his hatchet and fell onto his face, Packer grabbed it and used it on him, hitting him in the top of the head to ensure that his would-be attacker was indeed dead. Then he spent the night in despair. He tried to leave the camp the next day, leaving the 4 dead men behind, but the snow was too deep, so he had to return to the gruesome arena. He covered the dead, but for several weeks, lived on the flesh that Swan had already cut from one of them. Each day he made a renewed attempt to leave, but each day the snow thwarted him, so he took more flesh from the dead. He estimated that he survived this way for about 2 months. I could not eat but a little at a time. Finally, when the snow looked to be thawing and crusting over, Packer packed a few pieces of human flesh, a gun, $70 he had found on the men, and went on his way. Just before he reached the agency at his very last camp, he consumed the last pieces of meat. He does not account for how some strips of human flesh were found along the way. He admitted that when he had led the 1874 party in search of the bodies, he had not gone all the way back because he had not wanted to venture closer to that site. Packer added that he had escaped from jail by using a penknife as a key and had initially gone to Arkansas and Arizona before heading to Wyoming. Once again, he claimed that this was a true confession, voluntarily made and sworn before a notary public. It was not his final version of the story. Alfred Packer's trial began on April 6, 1883, at the Hinsdale County Courthouse in Lake City, Colorado, for the murder of the elderly Israel Swan. According to witnesses, Swan's remains had shown evidence of a hand-to-hand struggle, implicating Packer in a much more violent episode than shooting a man in self-defense. Besides, it was not Swan he had claimed to shoot, but Bell. So why had Swan appeared to have struggled to save himself? Judge Melville B. Jerry presided. Preston Nutter, who had identified the 5 victims in the clearing, testified as a lay witness to what he had seen and what he knew. Using illustrations, he described for the jury the positions of the bodies as they had been found and said that all but one bore hatchet wounds to the head. That lone individual had been struck hard in the back of the head, which was mashed in. Oddly, the coroner, the man in the best position to offer a professional analysis, did not testify at all. He wasn't even called to do so. Since he had never recorded his observations of the condition of the remains, there was nothing in writing about the details to which the court could refer. In fact, no one who was experienced in criminal investigation testified at this trial. It was mostly a matter of who the jury would believe, and no one was a true eyewitness of the events save Packer himself. When recalled later in the trial, Preston Nutter described a hole he had seen in a bone severed from one of the bodies, and in his layman's opinion said it looked like a gunshot wound. He also described how the clothing of the deceased men had been cut and ripped up. He offered no explanation as to what he meant. Taking the witness stand, Packer defended himself for more than 2 hours, and in the process told several significant lies. He lied about his age, the nature of his military service, the fact that he had enlisted twice and been discharged twice, and the cause of his epilepsy, which he said had resulted from walking guard duty. Addressing the issue at hand, he denied any blame in the deaths of most of the party, but he admitted that he had shot and killed a hatchet-wielding Wilson Bell in self-defense. He also spoke of the deaths of the others, and said that some of those who had survived longer had eaten the others to stay alive, a direct contradiction of his second confession, in which only Bell had done this. However, when all of this gruesome activity allegedly had occurred, Packer himself had been scouting for a trail or for food. He returned to find human remains already boiling in a stew pot, although he did admit to taking meat from the bones of 2 of the deceased, Bell and Miller, to stay his own hunger. Because he'd offered several versions of his experiences at different times, and had admitted to taking the victim's belongings and money, despite his superficial patter, things did not go well for him. Worse still, on the witness stand, he was quarrelsome and flippant. Some of his fabrications were transparent attempts to save himself. Like most liars, Packer believed he had made his case with his detailed presentation, but the jury did not accept his version of the tale. On Friday, the 13th of April in 1883, 9 years after he had emerged from the wilderness, Alfred Packer was convicted of the premeditated murder of Israel Swan. Legend has it that Judge Gary then pronounced the sentence as, "Stand up, you voracious man-eating son of a bitch, and receive your sentence. When you came to Hinsdale County, there was 7 Democrats. But you had 5 of them, goddamn ya. I sentence you to be hanged by the neck until you're dead, as a warning again reducing the Democratic population of this county. Packer, you Republican cannibal, I would sentence you to hell, but the statutes forbid it." What Jerry, a literate man, actually said, according to court documents, was, "Close your ears to the blandishments of hope. Listen not to the flattering promises of life, but prepare for the dread certainty of death." He was apparently convinced that the motive for the murder was robbery, not survival or self-defense. In a long statement, Jerry claimed that the sentence was painful for him to pronounce. "I would to God the cup might pass from me." He mentioned that the murder was revolting in all its details, and that the trial had been fair, with a jury of 12 impartial men. Jerry's version was that the 5 victims laid down to go to sleep and Packer exploited their trust and vulnerability to effect his attack. Although he had been convicted only of the death of Israel Swan, the assumption in Jerry's admonition was that Packer had willfully murdered the entire crew. "To other sickening details of your crime I will not refer," said Jerry. "Silence is kindness." Clearly he was referring to the cannibalism of human remains. He did seem to think that Packer's conscience had bothered him all these years and kept his crimes fresh in his mind. "You, Alfred Packer, sowed the wind. You must now reap the whirlwind. Your life must be taken as the penalty for your crime." Alfred Packer was condemned to be hanged on May 19, 1883. "Until you are dead, 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 and may God have mercy upon your soul." Contrary to many stories told years later, and even today, see internet biographies, Packer was never charged with, tried for, or convicted of cannibalism or crimes related to cannibalism. But it was not over yet. The man-eater was not about to be hanged, and he had one more version of the story to tell. 2 years later, Packer won the right to a new trial to take place in Gunnison, about 30 miles away. The Colorado Supreme Court had set aside the murder conviction based on a technical legislative oversight. Packer could not be tried in 1883 for a crime he had committed in 1874, because there had been no state murder statute in 1874 that allowed for it. In other words, he had been arrested when Colorado was a territory, but tried when Colorado was a state. Some later said that he had committed the crime on an Indian reservation, so by all rights, he should have been tried in a federal court, not a state court. At any rate, he was retried in 1896 for all 5 deaths, not just Israel Swan, on a different charge, voluntary manslaughter. The jury in that trial also convicted him. Some reports say it was the same jury, but they only sentenced him to 40 years, 8 for each of the 5 deaths, in the state penitentiary. On August 7, 1897, he wrote a letter to D.C. Hatch of the Denver Rocky Mountain News, with the longest version yet of the events that had taken place on that snowy mountain pass. Much of it was reprinted in the newspaper, though dramatized a bit. He claimed that even before the 6 men set out, the entire party of 21 had been suffering from extreme hunger due to lack of planning and supplies on the trip from Utah. They were living on horse feed. Chief Ouray gave them assistance and they camped near his settlement. He told them that the mountains were impassable. He then said that a man named Lutzenheiser and 4 others decided to go on across the mountains to the agency. Ouray supposedly told them that it was only 40 miles away, when in fact it was 80. They soon ran out of supplies and cast lots to see who would become food for the others. But they spotted a coyote, and so spared anyone from being killed. Not long after, they came across a cow and killed that as well. The cow's owner followed Lutzenheiser's tracks and took him back to a camp. He found the others and aided them as well. When they revived, they started out again. Packer claims that this was all a matter of court record. They were again picked up near exhaustion and starvation. At this point, Packer returns to the experience of his own party of 6. They left about a week after Lutzenheiser's party and took a different trail. Their provisions lasted about 9 days. 3 days after the food ran out, they cooked and ate their rawhide moccasins, wrapping their feet in blankets. "Our suffering at this time was most intense," he wrote. "Such, in fact, that the inexperienced cannot imagine. They kept going since the snow quickly buried their trail from behind." He again points out that Wilson Bell suffered mental derangement from starvation, and everyone else was frightened of him. They finally descended to the lake fork of the Gunnison River and camped there. In the morning, Packer went to look for signs of civilization. When he returned, he saw Bell alone, just as he had related in a prior telling. But in this retelling, Bell came at him. He shot in self-defense, and then he realized that the other men were murdered. "Can you imagine my situation? My companions dead, and I left alone, surrounded by the midnight horrors of starvation, as well as those of utter isolation." He could hardly believe he had ever returned in a rational frame of mind. He sat down and saw the flesh that Bell had cut from Miller, cooking on the fire, but he did not partake. Instead, he laid it aside and covered his slain comrades. Finally, in the morning, he ate some of the flesh and it made him feel ill. "My mind at this period failed me." He did not want to believe it, but he thought he must have eaten some of the flesh. He could not recall. He stayed there for some time. He did not know how long, but in his wandering, looking for food, he somehow stumbled into the agency. Without realizing it, he had traveled 40 miles. Although by all reports, he came in looking quite healthy. He claims in this letter that he had to be taken care of for 3 weeks. He learned the Lutzenheiser and his party also made it out, and the rest of the 21 men who had begun the trip had come over with the Ute. Packer says that he confessed at once that he had killed Bell, but had attributed the deaths of the others to Bell, not consistent with his initial confession before General Adams. He claimed that he had been unable to show anyone where his comrades had lain because deep snow had driven them back. He was then arrested, and he said that it was the sheriff who actually let him go and told him to go away. The sheriff apparently had taken compassion on him for all that he had been through. He does not explain why, if he was freed by the law, he then had to live under an assumed name. "Am I the villainous wretch which some have asserted me to be?" he asks. No man can be more heartily sorry for the acts of 24 years ago than I. He felt he had been unjustly dealt with, there having been no motive for why he would attack his fellow man. The ghosts of the dead men, he believed, knew that he was innocent. Eventually, with some political assistance, he was freed from prison. After serving 16 years in prison, Packer made a petition for parole. His case was reviewed and parole was denied. A reporter at the Denver Post, Polly Pry, grew interested in his case and believed he was innocent. She began a campaign for Packer's release, and with the paper's support, got the attention of the governor. Packer made another application for parole based on his deteriorating physical condition, and in 1901, the parole was approved. The prison physician had certified that Packer was suffering from Bright's disease, which made further confinement dangerous in terms of its aggravating factors. In addition, Packer had persuaded prominent men around the state, notably reporters and the owners of the Denver Post, to sign a petition on his behalf. The owners believed they could get Packer to be a sideshow freak in the cell's Floto circus for their profit. The governor had not changed his mind about the offenses, so Packer was not pardoned, but he did see warrant in permitting him to be released from imprisonment. He went to Denver and worked at the newspaper as a guard, but city life did not please him, so he moved to Deer Creek Canyon in Jefferson County. Yet he did not have long to enjoy his freedom. His final years were spent managing 2 mines and telling children the stories of his adventures as he dealt with his liver and stomach ailments. Many said that he was a nice old man. Late in 1906, a state game warden found Packer unconscious a mile from his home, and for the few months that remained to him, he came into the care of a Mrs. Van Alstyne. Just before he died on April 24, 1907, from a stroke, listed as senility, trouble, and worry, he wrote a letter to the governor to request a full pardon. No action was taken. Buried in Littleton, Colorado at Prince Avenue Cemetery, Lot 65, he had, and continued to gain, many supporters who believed that he was a victim of circumstance and had killed other men because he was starving, although at both of his trials, he himself had eschewed this claim. He was buried at government expense because he was considered a military veteran and for years had received a disability pension of $25 a month, for which he had filed from prison claiming his epilepsy had derived from his stint in the military. The military also paid for a tombstone which read, Alfred Packer, cum ef. 16 U.S. Infos. According to the Littleton, Colorado newspaper, The Independent, Packer's last words before he died were, "I'm not guilty of the charge." Years after the fact, in 1928 or 1968, the citizens of Lake City erected a monument for the victims and threw a community fish fry. Exactly where the victims had been buried, however, proved to be a source of some contention. In 1981, Governor Lamb denied Judge Kushner's posthumous pardon of Alfred Packer. Then in 1989, an event occurred that drew the nation's attention back to this man. James E. Starrs, a law professor from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., visited Gunnison one day in 1989 and heard some of the stories. Having long been curious about Packer's 2 trials and his chosen defense, he looked for the spot where the victims had been buried. Townspeople directed him to various places like Dead Man's Gulch, but no one was altogether certain. Starrs decided to ask the owners of the property on which a monument with the victims' names had been erected if he could dig down and find evidence of the remains. They granted permission, he obtained insurance and several grants, and planned for an archaeological dig. He wrote about the experience in his own newsletter, Scientific Sleuthing Review. The dig commenced on July 17, 1989, a bright sunny day, with a team that included anthropologists, archaeologists, photographers, student diggers, a lawyer, and other forensic personnel. Local media were on hand from around the state to document anything that was found. After checking the soil composition and pH level, Starrs started the dig with a team of experts who had brought in a ground-penetrating radar device. After they ran the machine over the area, they told him they suspected that whatever anomaly was below the surface was not very deep, possibly only a foot. They advised against using a backhoe, lest the shovel crush bones that might be close to the surface. So the anthropologists and students took over with hand trowels, and it wasn't long before they discovered human remains. Digging for the rest of the day, they uncovered all 5 victims, laid out side by side. The bones were not intermingled, which made things easier for the forensic anthropologists, and they were photographed, boxed, labeled, and taken to the anthropology lab at the University of Arizona at Tucson. There, the bones were laid out and carefully examined, while a few pieces were sent on to the anthropological curator of the Smithsonian Institution, Douglas Ubelacher, for dating and age analysis. Using known data, they managed to figure out the identities of each set of remains and then did a more detailed examination for bone damage. It can be difficult to make decisions about cause of death on skeletal remains unless there has been a wound from bullet, knife, or blunt force that penetrated or broke a bone. In this case, given the various witness accounts, they did expect to find trauma, so they were careful to document everything. One of the anthropologists, upon seeing the bones, had shouted that there was a bullet hole in one set of remains, but it turned out to be a hole that animals had gnawed and could not be ascertained as having been made by any weapon. Nevertheless, the story got into the newspapers erroneously. 3 of the bodies had blunt force blows to the head, as well as cuts to the arms and hands, which Professor Stars interpreted as defensive wounds. He also believed that nicks on the bones that appeared to have been made by a knife was evidence of defleshing. While not everyone on the team agreed about how much actual support there was for making a definitive statement, Stars went on record as saying that Packer was a murdering cannibal and liar. The remains were reburied in a wooden box in the same spot, with a solemn ceremony. In the meantime, in 1997, a curator for the collection of the Museum of Western Colorado in Gunnison claimed to have discovered Packer's revolver, an 1862 Colt. It had been collected from the massacre site, he said, when the victims were initially discovered. It was loaded, with 3 bullets in the chamber. According to some reports, including curator David Bailey's, this discovery corroborates the details of Packer's account, or at least of one of his confessions. Stars disputes that Packer owned such a gun and says there are no records that a revolver was recovered when the victim's remains were found. Regardless of whether Packer owned such a gun, the fact that he'd shot a bullet or 2 is no indication that he killed in self-defense. He might have shot at some game, or he might have outright murdered one or more of his party. Even a bullet hole located on any member of the party would not clarify that issue. Packer's guilt or innocence may always remain a mystery, but his story continues to fascinate scholars and lay people alike. People have not forgotten Alfred or Alfred Packer. While a collected archive of documents exists in Colorado, from his prison record to the court cases to his bid for parole, other forms of entertainment poke fun at the man. The University of Colorado at Boulder named their student cafeteria the Alfred Packer Memorial Grill, apparently as a derisive statement about the food served there. A documentary movie was made, The Legend of Alfred Packer, as well as 2 musicals, which appear to be mostly a joke. One is supposedly called Cannibal, the musical, and the other Alfred Packer, the musical. The former is said to have been made by the creators of South Park, while the latter is a clearly amateur attempt either at filmmaking or internet practical jokes. Roadside attractions on the way to Lake City along Cannibal Trail make light of the fact that 5 men died with caricatures and cannibal collectible dolls. At the Hinsdale County Museum, one can see an alleged skull piece from one of the victims, the shackles that Packer wore in prison, and buttons from the clothing of the victims. Thousands of tourists visit his grave every year. And so, our journey into the depths of Alfred Packer's story comes to an end. The man who became a legend, blending survival and brutality, truth and mystery. No matter where the truth lies, Packer's story remains one of the most controversial tales in American history. Was he a victim of harsh circumstances or a monster hiding behind the mask of survival? We'll leave that for you to decide. Thank you, dear viewers, for joining us in this thrilling episode. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to support us by liking, sharing the video, and subscribing to the channel to stay updated with our latest content. Until we meet again with another story full of mystery and horror, take care and stay tuned for more of our spine-chilling tales.